We have on my left Andrew Micha, and he is at the Atlantic Center, Atlantic Council, and he has a background in European affairs. He taught at the Marshall Center, which is the premier U.S.-sponsored center in Garmisch, Germany, for training former Soviet and Eastern Bloc military leaders. He is written extensively on these problems, and we're honored to have you here today, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
On my right is Brigadier General Florin Tomiuc.
Almost there.
Still working on the Romanian. But Florin is recently promoted Brigadier General and is the defense attaché to the U.S. from Romania. And he also has extensive experience in the European theater. We're honored to have you here, General.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And I'd like to start off with a general question. I prepared a couple of questions here, anticipating that we would have General Clark, which we did. The first is about resolving the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. What conditions and/or guarantees should the European Union and NATO advance or promote in the resolution of this conflict? We know that on both sides of the conflict, President Putin and President Zelensky have a very strong mandate to continue fighting. So what conditions do you think, Andrew, we'll start with you, that the EU and NATO should be pushing for in the resolution of the conflict? Assuming that one of the outcomes is to not continue this pattern of Russian misbehavior, which began after the 2014 annexation of Crimea.
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be speaking to this group. And let me unpack the question into two parts. One, I will tell you what I think would work if you are to provide for lasting stability and security of Ukraine. And then I will tell you what I think is more likely to happen, considering where the Europeans are and where our policy debate is going. The larger context of this is that actually John mentioned Putin's misbehavior since 2014. It actually goes further back. Starts with actually the failure in Bucharest of George W. Bush to push for NATO membership for Ukraine and for Georgia, that was blocked mainly by the French and the Germans at that time. And right after that, you had the invasion of Georgia and the seizure of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Then you had the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Then you had the butchering Syrians at Aleppo to bring Russia back into the Middle East. Then you had the second invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and you have the follow-on war until this day. I'm bringing these facts up front just to say the following. We are looking at progressive failure of deterrence across the European theater. We've had multiple instances of that, and now we also see this happen in the Middle East. I mean, Putin invades Ukraine in 2022 for the second time. Hamas attacks our closest ally in the Middle East in 2023. And then Iran, warned by President Biden not to attack Israel after the Israelis kill one of their generals, they launch an all-out attack at Israel, unprecedented. And to put the icing on the cake, we have North Korean troops now in the European theater, a formerly non-combatant country that's not only supplying the Russians, but also sending now personnel. I mean, not to mention the Houthis, the recruitment that the Russians have organized. So the larger problem is we have what I call an axis of dictatorships. That's Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran right now working together. It's a de facto alliance. It's based on interests rather than any sort of values. If you know anything about Russia, and I've been there, this is not an alliance that the Chinese and the Russians would enter into, other than they're opposing the United States and our allies and partners across the globe. The second point I want to say is that, and I'm saying this with great pain because I just retired from the DoD last year. I'm back in DC for 1 year. So it's very liberating because I don't have to say my views do not represent the policy or position of the US government, the Marshall Center, or my wife, and this kind of stuff. So we can have a kind of an open conversation. The message that Putin received every single time he used military power to score a geopolitical win violated every principle that the Europeans are supposed to stand for. And he not only got away with it, but he got a slap on the wrist, and in fact, got rewarded. So after Georgia, he gets Nord Stream 1 completed. After he invades Crimea, Nord Stream 2 is started. It's not that it's even completed. He starts to play a game of managing migration flows and being able to talk to the Europeans in a very tough manner. And then our withdrawal from Afghanistan, which wasn't our finest hour in terms of how it was executed, and I'll just leave it at that, encouraged him to believe that he is facing the West that has incredible capabilities, but lacks the willpower to use them to deter him. Deterrence rests on these two elements. You have to have capabilities and political will to use it. And this is a thug from Leningrad, who understands only one thing. If somebody punches him in the nose, he's going to stop. If somebody continues to negotiate with him, he's going to continue to push forward. Ukraine is part of a larger dilemma that we're facing today. I watch a lot of Russian news because of what I do and what I write about. And it's very damaging to my health, as you can imagine. But I can tell you one thing, he's not fighting Ukraine. He's fighting a civilizational war against the West and against NATO. It doesn't matter that NATO says we're not at war with Russia. What matters is the Russians say they're at war with NATO. And if he wins, he will have scored a civilizational win. It's not going to be the defeat of Ukraine. It's going to be the defeat of the collective West, as they like to call it. What you also see is the emergence of what I call the Eurasian option for the Russians. It's a de facto de-Westernization of Russia. It's not just crazies like Dugin and people of that kind that talk in those terms. And the problem that we're facing is that the Chinese are watching this very carefully. The Atlantic and the Pacific theaters are interconnected. And if we lose credibility in Europe, I submit to you, we're going to lose credibility in the Indo-Pacific. It's even worse. I have only bad news right now, and then I have something positive to say. They've managed to extend the conflict now from Eastern Europe into the Middle East. I think the next area where you're going to see a lot of tension develop will be the Korean Peninsula. The 2018 agreement that the South and North Koreans have signed is gone. It's been basically shredded. The Russians have most likely assisted in the satellite launch for the North Koreans. The North Koreans are supplying weapons, munitions, and now also personnel to Russia. Every single time that theater stretches, it pulls our limited resources away from one theater to the next to the next. And of course, then the Indo-Pacific is the icing on the cake. This is in the context of the United States that today is spending about 3.1 to 3.2% of our GDP on defense. That's about half of what we spent during the Cold War, okay? If you factor inflation in weapons acquisition and munitions and the rest of it, we're probably somewhere at 2.7% of GDP, of what we're actually able to buy with that money. Our authorized joint force in the NDAA stands at 1.3 million. We never dropped below 2 million in terms of our military personnel during the Cold War. So we have, in effect, a military that's structured to fight only in one major theater, maybe one secondary. We have now 2 theaters. We have 4 adversaries that are unified. And our defense industrial base, because of the peace dividend nonsense and the globalization and all that baloney you've heard for over 30 years from Mr. Fukuyama and others, nothing personal against Frank. I like him, I respect him, but he was just wrong. Our defense industrial base today is about 30% of what it was at the end of the Cold War. And the Europeans are thoroughly disarmed except for the countries along the flank. The Finns are very serious about the military. They can stand up an army of 280,000. The Poles are rearming, but they have sent most of their armor to the Ukrainians, so it'll take them some time to rebuild. Notice they're buying South Korean equipment. Why? Because we don't have the capacity to supply them at scale with armor that they need. And then, the Balts are essentially city-states, millions, some and change. So they're doing what they can, but they're not going to be the game changers. And the Romanians are serious, but Romania has huge economic problems today. And Romania is in a terrible neighborhood right now. The Black Sea is effectively closed for all practical purposes. The Russians are running roughshod over anything that they can possibly do. And if Ukraine were to collapse, it would not just be a naval and air problem, because I would submit to you, Moldova would be taken as a rounding error by the Russians. It would be a speed bump. And you would have in Romania land forces on Romanian border, in addition to all the threat that the naval and air power of the Russians is posing. So the situation is extremely serious. What worries me is that we are talking about how do we freeze this conflict rather than how do we actually create a vision of victory that stabilizes the region. And for 3 years, and again, this is not a partisan argument on my part, but our obsession with escalation management is what dominated all our approaches to Ukraine. And as a result, Ukraine is now at a position where I think the trends are extremely negative. Ukraine is not just running out of weapons and munitions, Ukraine is running out of people. Ukraine, when it became independent, it had about 51 million people in 1991. When the Russians invaded for the second time, it was about 40 million. Today, my calculation is there are about 25 to 30 million Ukrainians left in the country. And if they don't go down to drafting 18-year-old men into the military, they're going to run out of personnel. The army that we helped train, and I worked with the Ukrainians when I was in Germany, and it was the best army they had. That army was attrited in the second offensive. I would stipulate, had we given the Ukrainians for the first offensive what we gave them for the second one, they had a chance of breaking the Russians at the strategic level at that time. During the first offensive, the Russians had no leadership, no logistics, and most of all, they had no defenses. Our concern about escalation throughout all of that, and the Russians are playing the nuclear card brilliantly, and I'm not dismissing the threat of nuclear weapons. You're dealing with a nuclear power, and it's always there, but I think the risk of vertical escalation to nuclear in Ukraine is relatively low. Horizontal escalation across the region is high. And I don't have to tell our Romanian friends how often the Russians are violating the airspace of the countries on the frontier, how often they're doing cyber shots, attacks. They're trying to fracture the alliance. So I've been writing since this war started that the only solution to the security of Eastern Europe is a regional solution. There are no one-country solutions here. And there are only 3 countries on the region that have the population resources to actually raise large enough conventional militaries to deter the Russians within the NATO framework. Please, I have no patience for any European armies. So if you want to talk about strategic autonomy in Europe, I'm going to leave. Please don't. It makes no sense. That is Poland, Ukraine, and Romania. Finland is 5.5 million people. So even though they have military service from the age of 18 to 60, they don't have the population depth to do it. So in my view, the only way to actually secure Ukraine is to bring Ukraine into NATO. And I've been writing about this and arguing about this from the very beginning. The reason why the Baltic states are still independent and sovereign is because they are in NATO. Let's make no bones about it. The only thing that deters Putin is the risk of triggering a conflict with the United States because it brings into the play the US nuclear umbrella to Europe and the rest of it. So the debate of how do we secure Ukraine, freeze the conflict in some shape or form, and yet come up short of NATO membership, we're basically giving the Russians a breather when he's going to rearm, refit, and he's going to push for more. And let me conclude on this. If you look at our national security strategy, we talk about China as a pacing threat and Russia as an acute threat. I think both terms are incorrect. China is an existential threat, and we can talk about this in a different venue if you want. But the Chinese are trying to change the entire mode of governance, if you will. And they're quite successful now pitching this to the global south and kind of cutting into different areas of the world. The Russians are not an acute threat. The Russians are a chronic threat. Putin is relitigating the end of the Cold War. It is a quintessentially revisionist power. And what he wants is to rebuild the Eastern Slavic core of his empire and then get a sphere of privileged interest in Central Europe, and that includes Romania and all the flank countries. He wants the kind of Bismarck in reverse deal with the largest European members of the European Union, especially Germany and France. And if you look at everything that he has done trying to make Europe dependent on Russian energy, Germany went from about 35% of dependence on Russian gas in 2014 to close to 60%, 50 something, 57 I think it was, when the war started. And so he wants to bypass the flank, he wants to limit your sovereignty, he wants to make sure that he will have a say on your energy policy, on your military policy, and the rest of it. This is trying to revise the outcome of the Cold War. And he will not stop, in my view, because that imperial narrative remains. You can over-rationalize history, but if you look at interwar Germany, for example, Weimar, which was total mess for the Germans, but Weimar was based on the Dolchstoßlegende, as the Germans called it, the stab in the back. The argument was the great German nation was not defeated in World War I, it was betrayed by politicians, by cowards, by what. That gave them Hitler, and that gave them a second bid for empire. And it finally took the combined resources of the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and some others to break that imperial narrative. And the Germans had to figure out how to become a normal nation state, if you will. The Russians look at the Putin era, at the Yeltsin era as their Weimar. That the Soviet army was not defeated, it was betrayed by cowardly Gorbachev, drunken Yeltsin, most of all the West, the Muscovy Duck, what have you. And so he's going to restore what the Russians call Pax Russica, Veliki Ruski Mir. He's going to rebuild the glory of the Russian nation. And until the Russians are dealt a strategic defeat, and we had an incredible opportunity to do so in Ukraine during the first offensive, that we missed. That narrative will continue, and Russia will continue to be a threat to European security. Notice what's happening already. The Belarusian military is fully integrated in the Russian defense establishment. In effect, when I'm in Warsaw, I tell the Poles, you already have Russian forces in all practicality on your border, right? If Ukraine falls, it's going to be the same thing. Flip it now, the positive side. If Ukraine survives as a working, successful democratic state, this will have a dramatic impact on Belarus. If you saw those young men and women who were beaten in the streets of Minsk because they were protesting the stolen election, that to me was a sign of tremendous hope, that there is an emerging Belarusian national identity. And so if Ukraine wins, Europe wins, meaning that it defends itself successfully and remains secure. And final comment, you probably have heard President Macron is talking about building some sort of European peacekeeping force for Ukraine in the event the conflict is frozen and there's an armistice. And he's talking about 5 brigades. That's about 40,000 plus. If you add enablers to this, that's 50,000 easy or beyond. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is fantasy. This is magical thinking. There isn't enough NATO forces forward deployed that could actually generate that force, number one. Number two, if that force doesn't include US forces, you're inviting disaster because Putin will effectively challenge that and try to show us, because if indeed there's an attack at that peacekeeping force, that he is attacking a NATO force. And if the French soldiers are killed or Polish forces are killed or whatever, there will have to be some sort of response from the alliance. So we are in this very, very difficult period where we're trying to come up with a solution to a problem that can only, in my view, be solved by bringing Ukraine into NATO. And unfortunately, I don't see this in the card in the foreseeable future. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Very insightful.
I'm sorry I'm not positive. It's like, other than this, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln? Right now. No, it's
I think the important thing that you've brought up is the historical context that we're dealing with here. There is a current effort to say, well, let's find a peace deal. Let's negotiate a peace. And that's essentially what happened in 2014. And that peace was something that Russia signed up for and then promptly violated. So we have to have that historical context going forward, and it makes the problem, the solution set more challenging, no question about it. But we can't back away from that. I'd like to turn now to Florin and ask you more specifically about the Black Sea and what needs to be done to ensure freedom of access to the Black Sea, given that's where a lot of the action is occurring at the mouth of the Danube, Snake Island, etc.
Thank you, John. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. Good morning. Bună dimineața. It's a little bit cold here, but that's by purpose, to keep us awake and to stay alive. So it was a very nice introduction made by Mr. Micha. He's extensive analyst on strategic and on alliance and eastern flank. I will continue by saying that whatever this freezing conflict or peace agreement or whatever it will be called in the end, it has to contain, besides the guarantees for Ukraine, that they will not lose any other territories and Russians will not continue this conflict in Ukraine. The entire eastern flank should be included in this agreement. Black Sea has been under pressure for 2 years at least. Russians are doing a lot of activities on the Black Sea by spoofing or jamming, provoking a lot of troubles to economical vessels, transportation, and considering that Romania has large resources on the Black Sea that will start being exploiting soon, we have to ensure that the freedom of navigation and the freedom of Black Sea will be guaranteed after this conflict. So unfortunately, right now, there is no NATO force on the Black Sea due to the Montreux Convention, but definitely after the peace agreement will be signed and the conflict will be ended, I guess the first thing that should be done by NATO is to continue what has been done before the conflict, to have exercises, big exercises on the Black Sea to maintain and to show the presence and to assure that the security and the freedom of navigation on the Black Sea is available for everyone. Everybody is talking about the eastern flank on the northeastern flank. Not that much about southeastern flank. And I would say the southeastern flank is more fragile. I'm saying that for various reasons. I'm saying that because Romania has the longest border with, we have the border with the Republic of Moldova, and we did support it a lot, Republic of Moldova, to continue the European path. And we should pay much more attention on the southeastern flank. Therefore, the US presence, which now is on a rotational basis, should become a permanent one. The NATO presence in Romania, which is quite large right now, more than 1,500 NATO soldiers on our soil, should be increased. Luckily, we took very good decisions in the last couple of years, and we started to modernize, a bit late, but anyway, not too late, the entire army, and we decided, and this was one of the best decisions in Romania to move from Russians airplanes MiG to F-16, and now we realize this was the best decision in the last 10-20 years, because otherwise we would be now totally uncovered. Black Sea is important not only for Romania. This has to be understood here in Washington, D.C. Black Sea is important for entire Europe, but also for the United States. Black Sea is a critical area from where there are many possibilities to make the link between Middle East, Europe, and then even the United States. In terms of any kind of transportation, gas, electricity, but all other goods coming from Middle East. So, yes, the northeastern flank is important. Yes, now we have 2 more NATO countries joining on the northern flank. which makes a stronger NATO presence and alliance on the north. And again, I'm repeating, southeastern flank should be considered more fragile and more easy for Russian to attack in case we do not take any serious decisions. So I will end up here by saying that it's very much interesting to see how this conflict will end. Yes, I see we are not very optimistic on that, how Ukraine can win, but we should have on the terms some guarantees for ensuring the freedom of the Black Sea and ensuring and securing the entire southeastern flank with Russia, just to prevent any other potential intentions of Russians to continue this invasion in some other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, General. So you raise a very interesting topic here, because we want to deter the type of actual combat operations that Russia has been conducting in Ukraine. But there's more, we're in a new era of warfare, really. And maybe it's not that new, but we're starting to see the outlines of a different way of fighting. And this can be lumped under hybrid warfare or political warfare, but it's what Russia has been pretty good at in the past, the disinformation campaigns that they conduct in European countries, and they're subtle. They're cleverly designed to not indicate Russia's involvement. So my question to both of you is, how does Europe and NATO's a defensive alliance, how does it defend against these types of irregular threats? Andrew?
Yeah, so this is the larger question of the last 3 decades. I mean, if you think about it, we have allowed our adversaries, both the Chinese and the Russians, basically unrestricted access to every level of our societies for 3 decades. Because the argument was the neoliberal globalized world meant that everybody was going to move pretty much in the same direction. And so not only did we allow for Confucian institutes to be created on American campuses, we took entire production lines, technology, alloys, airframe designs, and the rest of it. And we handed it over to a 1.4 billion communist state on the assumption that, to quote one of our politicians, China will become, quote, a responsible stakeholder in the international system. I mean, what were we smoking? The same thing with the Russians, both access to assets across Europe, access to technology. The reason why the Russians are now really competitive in some areas of defense technology, like submarine propulsion systems, hypersonics, and things like that, is because they built on post-Soviet designs, and then they had access to Western technology. In 2019, I did a project when I was looking at foreign students in American universities, and we had about 1 million foreign students that year. And universities love foreign students. They come in, they pay full tuition, they don't complain. Of those 370, I think, thousand were Chinese grad students in STEM. We're training their weapons designers in our universities and our laboratories. We allow them to direct commission research in our labs. And then what happens if your company depends on access to that market and is making money in that market, it becomes a de facto advocate for continuing that policy. And again, you can call it partial elite capture, whatever you want to call it. I'll give you one example. During the Cold War, we had NATO COCOM restrictions, Coordinating Committee on Exports, that would not allow you to sell even a 386 Intel PC to the Russians because it was a dual-use technology. So I have no problems with Boeing or Airbus selling aircraft to China. They should never be building aircraft in China, because this, to a large extent, what we're looking at is the threat, is the monster we created. And we can debate whether this was just greed masquerading as an ideology, but it was about labor arbitrage. It was about making 80, 90% more on the dollar by offshoring. And the impact on our own societies has been devastating. Because if you offload about 30% of your industrial base, what you start seeing is your middle class begins to contract and your political system becomes less stable. Because the middle class is the core of political stability in a democracy, right? I mean, middle class dreams of becoming upper class, fears about dropping to become lower class, so it's not easily mobilized for radical politics. And on the Russia side, you know, European energy policy has been insane. I mean, there's no other way to describe this. Somewhere between the extreme of we're going to shut down all nuclear power in Germany, as I was sharing with John when I was still in Germany, and Scholz gave his Zeitenwende speech, and they were finally cutting off from the Russian gas supplies, they still shut down the 3 remaining nuclear reactors. You know, if you drive into Munich, I lived in Bavaria for 7 years, you can actually smell coal, because this is how, so you can drive your electric cars and virtue signal, but you generate electricity by burning coal. What am I missing? And what is it, what this is doing is it's making European industry less and less competitive. The reason why you have this tremendous pressure in Germany today, and I think second or third consecutive year of the economy contracting, is because of energy costs that are prohibitive. So we have allowed them access to our intellectual property. Several years ago, I saw a study that said 1 in 5 American companies doing business in China was extorted for intellectual property in exchange for market access. I mean, think about it. And when I would talk to business people, why do you agree? And all they say, that's just cost of doing business. We still make more money operating there than not. Why is this happening? And here's my principal argument. We took national security priorities out of economic policymaking at our own peril. And, you know, we forgot that the irreducible function of any state is national security. If you can't provide for that, you cannot decide your economic system, your political system, and the rest of it. And this mirage of this globalized, complex interdependence that American political science departments, and I'm a political scientist, I was an academic for 20 years, guilty, but I never talked in those terms. You know, complex interdependence. There's no such thing as complex interdependence in the international system. There's only dependence, and the question is who depends on whom for what. So if we're in a situation that 80% of our ingredients in medicines and drugs come from China, we're going to compete with the Chinese? You saw during the crisis PPE equipment always coming from China, and on and on and on. You know, the Chinese are about 35% of all manufactured goods across the globe right now, twice of what the United States is. And the indices of power are traditional. Access to our society, access to our social media, access to our internet. Why they control very judiciously our access to their public space and public domain and public discussion. So the solution that I see, and again, this is not going to be very popular in Europe because Europe likes to talk about de-risking. And I have no idea what it means. We're going to de-risk on China. It's like somebody's doing drugs and says, Mom, I'm going to be more careful. I'll de-risk. I'll only smoke in the morning, but I'll, you know. No, if we don't decouple our critical supply chains, you know, that any nation needs in the event that it goes to war, you need to have a degree of self-sufficiency and autarky to be able to function. Your adversary will not supply you with steel or computer chips or whatever the hell you need. And now as for the warfare itself, which is John's question is critical here. Yes and no. We've seen real changes in how you know, unmanned vehicles are used, drones and the rest of it. But some of the old elements of warfare have been reaffirmed. Mass matters. You know, the US military has lived in this environment of precision strike, controlled deep fires, and the rest of it. But if you look at the nature of the theater, because the Pentagon is so preoccupied with counting, you know, what are the capabilities, how many troops, what are the systems that they operate, what are the enablers, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what about geography? What about culture? What about the temporal dimension of the conflict? So if you look at the European theater, it's less than 20 miles from the Belarusian border to Vilnius. You know, we can have the most precise precision fires and put a missile on a pebble in the middle of the Mongolian desert. It won't make a difference if Putin puts a wall of steel and drives this old armor into a NATO territory, and every tank will take a Javelin missile or a round. And if you look at the stocks in Europe, they're non-existent. The Ukrainians were firing about 4,000 to 5,000 rounds per day of 155 howitzer ammo during the first offensive. At that time, the US production was about 15,000 rounds of howitzer ammo per month. The Ukrainians were shooting in 3 days of what our production rate was for a month. And in Europe, it's even worse, right? And if you talk to defense industrial base people, they will tell you we're not a charitable organization. Give us contracts, we're going to produce. But if the governments don't give contracts, how is this going to happen? We're 3 years into this war, and Europe still lags behind on rearmament. I mean, you have 23 of 32 allies that either are meeting or promising to meet the 2% of GDP on defense. That is a message to the Russians that we're not serious. Number two, I don't care about percentages of GDP on defense, because if you spend 80% of that 2% or even 10% on personnel, retirement, and things like that, and not on real deployable capabilities, it doesn't make any difference. If your Air Force can only fly in circles around Brussels, that's not an Air Force, it's a flight club. They have nice uniforms, you know, but they're not interoperable, they're not deployable. And we could go on and on and on. Military guys in the audience know what I'm talking about. So the answer has to be very simple. And every time I go to Europe, I rant like a Jehovah about this. Rearm, because if you want to stop Putin, he has to know that there is a wall of steel on the other side, and that there's a determination that if he crosses the line, he's going to get beaten back. And unfortunately, what you have in Europe is a regionalized security optics. So when I'm in Helsinki, Bucharest, Warsaw, you know, Tallinn, they get it. It's all about Russia because it's an existential threat. When I'm in Berlin, Berlin is, you know, Germany is no longer a frontier state. The Bonn Republic was a frontier state. That's why those installations that the Americans built are still there. But the fight is not there. The frontier now is Poland, Romania, and what the general said, I completely agree. We're underestimating how important the southeastern part of that flank is and how vulnerable Romania is, not just because of what's on the other side, but also what's behind Romania. And I'm going to leave it at that in terms of, you know, what the geostrategic environment is. So there is no shortcut. There is no magical sleight of hand. When I look at a continent that's close to 500 million in population in the European Union, that's been rolling in butter for 30 years, I mean, let's be frank, right? Europe has never had it so good. I've been coming to Central and Eastern Europe since 1990, and I remember looking at the post-communist ruin and seeing the change and the progress, huge success. Hats off to you guys. But you're telling me that a wealthy continent like this, with a GDP orders of magnitude bigger than anything the Russians can bring in, and the Russian Federation is a pale shadow of the Soviet Union. It's got about half the population of what the USSR had. It used to sit in the middle of Germany. It had 54 non-Soviet Warsaw Pact divisions at the snap of a finger. This is really not even in the same league, and you're telling me that the Europeans cannot provide the conventional capability to resource the regional defense plans that, by the way, everybody agreed to at Vilnius when they signed on to them. And those plans have capabilities commitments that are attached to them. And yet it's 3 years into this horror, and very little has been done outside of the flank.
So what I hear you saying, Andrew, is that economic policies matter.
Absolutely.
That is the coin of the realm in terms of real deterrence. And as long as Russia sees weak economic policies in Western Europe, it feels like, yeah, this is doable. We can take this. So it's putting your money where your mouth is. And that's a big question. But I want to dial back for a second, because we're closing in on the end of this panel, and ask the general here what irregular challenges Romania is going to face along its border with Ukraine and Moldova.
Okay, thank you. I will continue what Mr. Micha said. The technologies, due to the war, have been developed so fast, too fast. I think we didn't want that, but we have it, and we have to deal with this. Any unmanned aerial, submarine, surface are now challenging any country. we cannot purchase and the technologies as fast as the industry is developing the new one. So whatever you buy today, it can be obsolete tomorrow. So on the other hand, he mentioned about the stocks in Europe. Yes, I've been in some discussions here in DC with my colleagues from Poland and some others from other NATO countries. There are talks about regional stocks where NATO countries, European countries will have their own stocks in case any other threats. But this takes time. Do we have this time? Do we have 3 to 5 years to restart the defense industry in Europe, to fill all these stocks with ammunition and weapons? Do we have it? That's a question that I don't know who can answer to that. But definitely the defense industry in Europe should start again. And in Romania, we took some decision in this aspects, and we work closely mainly with Poland to deconflict and to start cooperation in defense industry. Whatever Poland is producing, Romania will not. Whatever Romania is producing, Poland will not. We have in Poland Abrams maintenance center. We have in Romania F-16 maintenance center. So it has to be done in cooperation. Therefore, Romania, it is a stability pillar, and we took a lead, and we restarted the work of a couple of initiatives on NATO as B9, Southeastern Ministerial Defense, the coalition on the Black Sea with Turkey and Bulgaria, and we are now on the third phase of the activation on this coalition, and we are expecting more countries to join. And going back now to John's question about what challenges we think we'll have, we already have it actually. Look at the grain transportation from Ukraine on the Danube. Look at the mines that are floating on the Black Sea. Look at the drones that were debris that are coming on our territories. Therefore, we will definitely continue to modernize the entire military in Romania. Last year, we had an increase of 45% of our budget for modernization, and most of this money are going to modernization, not the retirement, not the other thing that...
I'm not talking about Romania.
No, I know. But however, each of the country in the world, except Russia maybe, but including US, has a challenge nowadays with recruitment and retaining. And this is because there are so many, the new generation has different values. The new generation has more options than we had before. We cannot compete with the other industries that they are offering huge salaries, huge payments. So there are many challenges we face in military nowadays. We look for solutions. We found some. We do cooperate closely with all our allies, including and mainly with the United States. And we have been implementing a couple of new strategies in Romanian armed forces to be able to attract more people in the army, to retain them, and to have a very professional army. We have it actually, but we need more. The modernization process in Romania will continue, no matter what happened in elections. We have a strong commitment from our government. We'll continue to invest, and we have multi-annual projects that we've been started this year, and we'll continue to purchase the new technologies on the market. But as I said, it's so hard to choose the best technology which will stand for years. Look at the Ukraine. They got a lot of support, mainly on drones specifically. And after a couple of weeks, the drones that they got it, they realized that they cannot use it because the Russians were able to build up the countermeasures, and some of them were not useful anymore. So it is a challenge. It is a challenge for all of us, but we have to be and to stand together and to think together and to act together. That's the main idea. Thank you.
This concludes our panel discussion, and I want to thank the audience for their involvement and participation. So we will conclude now.
Question and answers? Q&A?
Q&A.
Q&A.
Yeah. Sorry, I have the microphone, so I'm going to start first.
Okay.
I can listen to this all day long, but the question I have is that another reason that the Black Sea is so important, which we do not really mention often enough, is the fact that whether it's a commercial purpose or military purpose, I think we have to recognize the fact that the sailing days from the Suez Canal to the port of Constanța is only 3.5 days. Sailing days from Suez Canal to Gdansk is more than 13 days. So we calculate just the simple commercial benefits of reducing the sailing days. So I just want to mention that because I'm a big port person. But I do have a question for Brigadier General Tomiuc, and that is, Romania political leadership has decided to increase its defense spending from 2%, the required 2%, to 2.5%. But we all know that we barely reached 1.6% last year. My question is, with the new incoming administration here, and I think President-elect Donald Trump has already alluded to this, in that he would like NATO members to increase its defense spending to 3%. And I think Andrew has already mentioned that out of 32 member states in NATO, even though 23 claim to have spent its 2% of defense spending budget, that's really not the case. So I'm asking a question as to what the Romanian military leadership is willing to do to convince the political leadership about increasing to 3%. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I see you have very precise percentage. I'm not that precise, but anyway, for sure, there were some decisions taken in Romania to make the processes for acquisition more flexible. And one of the reasons why we couldn't spend the entire budget was that the processes in the United States, which is the big defense industry market for FMS, is so complicated. Way too complicated, that takes years. So we didn't spend maybe the entire budget last year, but we started processes what are over our budget for the next couple of years. But therefore, there is a big decision on Romanian soil to look more careful on direct commercial sales for the future in order to avoid whenever is possible, of course, because there are some systems that cannot be purchased on direct commercial sales, but FMS cases. But to speed up the processes, to find the right technology that we need from United States, but also from other countries that can offer that, and to spend much more. Why and how the military leaders will convince the government, the political leaders to spend more than 2.5, I think it's easy. We don't have to convince them. They are aware about that. There are talks about that. And I'm sure we will have as much as we need to improve and to modernize the entire army. The problem is the processes. You know better than me, being in the United States, how much time it takes to access these processes and bureaucratical chain of approvals in the United States for some specific systems. Thank you.
The military doesn't have to. Congress does.
Of course.
Can you explain why we don't accept Ukraine into NATO promptly?
That's a very good question, and it's, I think, a question that should be asked of our decision makers and of people who are making policy. And I have one explanation for continuing to kind of flail about. I think what has evaporated in this town for the most part over the last 3 decades is the ability to think in geostrategic terms. If you listen to how we talk about national security, it's all normative and it's all values-based. We're defending the rules-based international order, great power competition, because we don't want to use the word war, whereas I would submit to you that the Russians are at least in phase 0 of this conflict. They're shaping the battlefield. I had so many briefings about great power competition and rules-based order. I have yet to hear what the victory looks like. What is the end game we're trying to get to? And if you start thinking in geostrategic terms, that you understand one fundamental thing. Big Brzezinski was right about it. Ukraine is key to whether Russia becomes or stops being an empire again. Because without Ukraine, Russia can no longer be an empire. It remains, in effect, disconnected from Europe. We have bought into the Russian narrative. Notice that even in Western media, you hear the expression NATO expansion. That's a Russian term. Semantics matter. When I was working NATO enlargement, we talked about enlargement as a democratically driven, open process where allies can make a decision on bringing somebody in or not. Putin operated on a simple assumption. You grab a little bit of territory of Georgia and Ukraine and you're putting a dilemma in front of the alliance. Well, you bring them in, you're in effect going to war with us. You want to take that risk? It's a larger conversation about the absence of leadership across the West, the inability to articulate to the public opinion how dangerous the situation is. The Russians are on a war footing. If you look at their economic spending and how they've reoriented their military and the rest of it, their rate of armor reconstitution is much faster than anything we anticipated, and the rate of rearmament on the NATO side is much slower, and that delta is the risk level for us. And I want to make a more general comment about the lack of real geostrategic or geopolitical understanding, because we've been living in this world of norms and values and normative and rational choice and all of that. Russia is not like a Western power. When I still taught the military, I would say the opening of any seminar on Russian way of war is to say the Russians are not like us. It's a different civilization. It's a different set of assumptions about what matters and what doesn't matter. I mean, to buy into the argument that somehow NATO is a risk to Russia is laughable. I mean, and the argument that somehow having the Baltic states or Ukraine and the alliance is a threat to Russia because what? Because this tiny duchy of Muscovy expanded into an 11 time zone empire while it was constantly defending itself? Something's irrational about this. So we're allowing this narrative to enter our political conversation, and we're using this as an explanation of our own inaction. We've lived for 3 decades in what I call a zero-risk society. We have created a culture where we avoid risk at any cost, at any price. And leadership is fundamentally about actually understanding that the international relations are not really international. It's a very Darwinian, self-help ecosystem that is inherently fraught with risk. And leadership is about taking the risk, making the decisions, and even if you fail, being willing to take that risk again until you get to the kind of end state you want to get to. If I were to ask you today, how many politicians have articulated the end state in Ukraine? I have relatives in Tennessee. If you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. That's the first thing, right? So stop doing the same thing over and over again. And the second thing, as the cliche goes, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. What does this mean? Russia cannot win, Ukraine cannot lose. That's how you fight wars. I've worked with the military for 20 years. If somebody came to me with an operational plan and say, sir, we're going to fight this war for as long as it takes, I would say, are you kidding me, Cardinal? If you go to war, you try to give the resources either to your ally or have the resources yourself to break the adversary at the strategic level, to get to a negotiated outcome from a position of strength. And the idea that we're going to fight this for as long as it takes, we're going to fight this to the last Ukrainian? There are no never-ending wars. Every nation has a breaking point. So what is the strategy? What is the outcome? And most of all, people keep asking about what is the end state in Ukraine. Why aren't we talking about what is the end state in Russia? Why is our policy towards Russia always, do they have a good czar or a bad czar, right? Remember, I like Mr. Gorbachev. I can do business with him. Maggie Thatcher. Yeltsin, when Yeltsin was, out there with Bill and they were doing the disco together. Oh, this is great, Russia. Now we get this goon out there who is threatening the rest of the world and is risking, he's going to set it on fire. Remember one thing. We're in a period of protracted systemic instability across the globe. Regional balances are about to fracture. And the system transforming global wars don't start because all of a sudden 1939 in September, Germany and the Soviet Union attacked Poland. It happens because regional balances, Manchuria begin to implode, Czechoslovakia begin to implode, Anschluss of Austria and all of that, and then finally everything unravels. We're at this very precarious moment. If we don't sustain the regional balances, Eastern Europe, Middle East, Korean Peninsula, and the Indo-Pacific, then we're risking a really global conflagration like we haven't seen. And at the same time, the conversation you hear in Washington is all about percentages of defense spending. I sat on a panel with a colleague recently who said, Andrew, the American people would never support defense spending higher than 3%. Senator Wicker is calling for 5% minimum, and we probably need to be we were never this low during the Cold War. We were at about half of what we were spending during the Cold War. And my answer was, has anybody made the case to the American people? Has anybody explained how dangerous the world has become? And I can tell you, my money is on democracies. Mobilized democracies, when they rally, they're unbeatable. But you have to explain directly and ask the American people and tell them about how difficult the situation is. And you have to explain what's at stake in Ukraine. Yeah, we can freeze this conflict, put some peacekeepers in there. He will use this as a breeder. The Russians are reconstituting their armor at rates of about 1,400 tanks per year because they're using all the equipment right now. They're pulling it in. Their new production is very limited. That will probably peak within the next 2 to 3 years. That's why I keep saying, do we have the time? Xi says to his military, be ready by 2027. I don't know if he means it or not, but still, every single day that passes that Europe is not rearming, our relative power position is getting worse. Remember, if Ukraine is taken over by the Russians, the personnel that is now in the NATO ledger will be in the Russian ledger. There is likely to be a guerrilla war of some kind, but most of the people will be forced into Russian security services. Look at what happened to Chechnya. And then you will have a migration into Europe of PTSD men who will feel betrayed, angry, who have used weapons for 3 years, lived under horrific conditions. You think you have a criminality and violence problem in Europe today? Think again. So none of this is part of the conversation. We're just trying to focus on how do we manage escalation and come down on it instead of saying what is the end state we want to get to in Ukraine and what's the most cost effective to get there. And you can Google me. I've been writing about the need to have Ukraine in the alliance, not because I like or don't like the Ukrainians. This has nothing to do with that. It's that if you want to stabilize Europe, that's the most cost-effective way of doing it. Thank you.
Thank you. As long as it takes. I think that's what President Biden has been saying for the last 2 years. Anyway, last question. We have room for one last question. Here it is.
Hello. In absence of NATO membership, the thing that's touted as second best is right now is having European troops in Ukraine potentially after a ceasefire is negotiated. Now you mentioned this earlier that it's a pipe dream. Just wondering if you could expand a bit more on that and what could potentially Europe do to make this less of a pipe dream as a workable solution if it gets there. Thank you.
Is that a question to me or to the general?
Oh, for yourself.
General? Yeah. Me? Go ahead, sir.
I really don't know what the European forces can, if this is the best solution for now to have European troops on the ground, PFP troops or something like this. As this was stated before, NATO membership of Ukraine, I guess, will be the best solution for having this conflict stopped forever. because we have to consider that Russia has started war industry and they are producing a lot. We in Europe, we are not producing as we should. And without strong guarantees for Ukraine and for Eastern flank, we are not sure that Russia will not continue this conflict. Ukrainian membership in NATO, it is the best guarantee for having this conflict stopped. So if you want to add something.
Yeah, I mean, look, everything will depend on the final analysis, what happens in Washington. Because if you look at military capabilities and logistics and enablers and the rest of it, I mean, the Europeans would not have been able to supply the Ukrainians without American logistics. Let's be frank about it. So what happens at the policy level in the United States, and in fairness, the nation is tired. The nation is exhausted after 2 decades of global war and terror, and various military campaigns, overseas contingency operations. Depending on whom you believe, Watson Institute at Brown, they tend to be left-leaning, but they estimate about $8 trillion in total cost of the last 2 decades. America needs some me time. If you look at our infrastructure, if you look especially at the heartland. By the way, when I came back from Germany, I heard the expression at dinner, flyover country, and I almost fell off the chair. How can you talk about your fellow citizens this way, that somehow the heartland is flyover country, that only the 2 coastal corridors matter? That's our own personal conversation. So I think what we can hope for is get to a point where Europe rearms, shows the capacity that it can supply Ukraine with weapons and munitions for the foreseeable future. I think the question of putting peacekeepers on the ground will be a huge point of disagreement. Because if you draw them from Europe, especially from among NATO members, you're in effect putting NATO forces into Ukraine, and any attack at those forces then will have tremendous repercussions for NATO cohesion, right? So that's going to be a huge issue. And secondly, the only way that this could actually work as a deterrent is with the United States being in that mix in terms of our military deployments. I don't think there's appetite to do that either. So what I think is going to happen is Putin will likely not accept a deal because he thinks he's winning, and unfortunately, the trends are not encouraging. Any frozen conflict in Ukraine, considering how much of the Ukrainian territory he has seized, and he's got Crimea, he's got about 20% of Ukrainian land, is a victory for him. He stood up to the West, and he has in effect gotten what he wanted. And especially if Ukraine's membership in NATO is foreclosed, that he achieved his principal political objective. And the consequences of this, I think, in other theaters will be extremely serious. I keep coming to my original point. Every time deterrence fails, it's very hard to restore it short of war. I don't know of many cases in history where you can actually say, well, we were able to rebuild deterrence. And even if you look at the Iranian attack on Israel, the missile and drone attack, we're shooting at arrows, not at archers. That is also a message, right? We're shooting millions of dollars in ordnance to shoot down $10,000 drones. I mean, if you look at the cost of a Patriot missile, for example, the whole model in which we build weapons and munitions and how we actually invest in our defense, all of this has to be rethought and reviewed. Because we may have the most sophisticated systems, but we don't have stockpiles, we don't have redundancies, we will not have the capacity to stop much less capable systems that the Russians are fielding. And especially if you look at the geography of this conflict. The Russians want us to fight a dumb fight. They want to come up close, set it up, cross the border. It's less than 130 miles to Warsaw. It's less than 20 miles to Vilnius. And the minute NATO is forced to fight on its territory to defend it, it's a very different conversation. So you have 32 allies. Every single ally has a different command and control system. The levels of digitization are different. The general knows this very well. How do you integrate all of that? These are the challenges we have to face. It's not just buying hardware, buying tanks or F-35s and the rest of it. And secondly, production capacity. Poland ordered F-35s in 2020. How many has it received by 2024? Anybody knows? 1. and it's here in the United States used for training. Finland has 60 some ordered. Romania has, this is a question of getting us to rethink how we build weapons so that we can actually get agile and start building at speed and scale. Because for 30 years, we've lived in an environment where our logistics were not threatened. We could literally schedule a war. We could say we're going to fight, with this many troops. This is our logistics. They're completely, secure when it comes to their supplies. Control every domain. If something goes wrong, we can hose it and get away. This is a different conversation. So once again, not to be too depressing, go back home and tell everyone, rearm, put pressure on your political class to restore your capabilities, showing that you have the capacity and capability to respond with force and political will send a message to the Russians that no, the NATO offense is sacred and you can't jump across it. And if you make a deal on Ukraine, you'll have to stick by it, not because we say so, but because we have the capacity to give the Ukrainians the weapons they need. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much.
Ma'am?
I'm
Thank you.
serious. I could listen to you all day, but we have to move on to the next
I
panel.
understand. It's been an honor. Thank you so much for having me. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I'll see you next in Bucharest.
Yes, yes.